Yeah. And yesterday, the discussion, both in some short plenary talks and in the breakouts, really focused on two key questions, and here they are. The first one is, what are the needs and roles that robots can play in these sort of crises? So we know the needs, and then, what are the barriers? What are the technical challenges, both in human and technical infrastructure, that really need to be addressed in order to meet those needs? So here we have basically the problem and the barriers. And today, the focus is really going to shift on developing a strategy. What can research, us academics, industry, and government do to accelerate our readiness for the next crisis, and again, perhaps even to do some things for the current crisis? And next slide, please. So today, this is briefly our outline. I will very shortly turn this over to the moderators for our question C. And after that exploration, we'll come back here for a full group conversation and some wrap up and some instructions as to how everybody in this workshop can help us create this report. So without further ado, let me turn the mic or the Zoom link or whatever over to our moderators for this next set of sessions. That would be Greg Hager from Johns Hopkins and Guru from NAE, Guru Madhavan from NAE. So Greg and Guru, it's yours.
Great, thank you, Russ. So if we could move to the next slide, just to pick up on Russ's stage setting theme and getting everybody kind of back into context. The goal, as you recall, is really to start to get some focused thinking around how we might frame out both the current state of the field and where the field might go. So we will, after some opening talks, 3 opening talks, be going into breakouts. And I thought I would just put up the questions before the breakout so that you get a chance to think about them while the speakers are speaking. So here are some of the things we're going to be asking you to think about as we go to breakouts. First, talking about the sorts of mechanisms that could drive infectious disease motivated technology development, thinking about related questions of policy. How do policy figure into creating those mechanisms? Network creation, we actually have had some discussion already about the fact that there were a lot of kind of ad hoc conversations. Antonio Vici yesterday talked a lot about that from Italy. And also, I think this is crucially important, how do we think about communicating the impact of our innovations? So we have lined up 3 amazing speakers to kind of help whet your thinking about those areas. And I'd like to immediately get them online and give them a few minutes to give their thoughts. So our first speaker is Lynn Parker. Lynn is the Assistant Director of Artificial Intelligence at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She's detailing there from her position as a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She also previously served as the interim dean of the College of Engineering there, and she was an NSF Division Director of Information Intelligence Systems. And in addition to that, she spent several years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory as a distinguished research and development staff member. So you can see Lynn is somebody who's really spanned both academia, government, national labs, really has a very broad perspective on how government and academia can respond in crises like this. And so I'm looking forward to hearing her remarks. Lynn, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. And it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk with everyone here today. So, given that we're all working our way through a current crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought it would be useful to spend my remarks here talking about a couple of technology examples from this crisis that have worked very well, have really been overwhelming successes in helping to address certain scientific aspects of the pandemic response. And I think that these use cases will give examples of the mechanisms that can drive the technology toward the needed solutions. And I think they also suggest the roles for academia and industry and government in accelerating the readiness for a crisis. So hopefully from these examples, we can draw lessons from them in terms of what made these use cases successful, and then hopefully that will inform how best to prepare for future crises. So specifically, I want to talk about our number one, our White House call to action to AI experts for text mining coronavirus publications. And then the second is our COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium. Now, both of these cases involve a number of key ingredients that have led to their success. I think first is strong partnerships. Strong partnerships across industry and academia and government and even internationally. And second is the ability to deliver scarce but critical resources to use in high-impact problems. And then third, they were both designed specifically to empower a broad spectrum of researchers from across the nation and even the world, actually, with the resources that they need to advance our understanding of coronavirus and how best to respond and recover during the pandemic. So first, let me talk a couple of minutes about the White House call to action to AI experts. So early on in the pandemic, this was late February and early March, our White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP, was thinking deeply about how we can empower AI technical experts across the nation to help in the fight against COVID-19. About that time, we were beginning to hear from scientists who were commenting on how quickly the scholarly literature was growing. There were dozens of papers being published each week. And the medical and scientific community was saying that it's just too difficult, and it will continue to be too difficult to keep up with that ever-growing literature. The last I checked, there are nearly 35,000 papers on coronavirus that have been published just since mid-January, and nearly 2,200 new papers were published just within the last week. So clearly this is a task for AI or text mining in particular. AI can be a helpful tool for researchers to comb through all of the information and help make connections and help the researchers gain scientific insights. But of course, first the publications needed to be freely available with the legal permissions for secondary analysis to include machine learning. So OSTP led a call by the chief science advisors from around the world, and this was a call to the scholarly publishing community, asking them to voluntarily make the COVID-19 related publications and data immediately available in a public repository. And we also requested that new and existing articles be made available in a machine-readable format to allow for full text and data mining with rights accorded for research, reuse, and secondary analysis. So we received an overwhelmingly positive response from more than 36 publishers. And so quickly they dropped their paywalls to all the research and data on COVID-19 and allowed for reuse. But of course, making this effort successful hinged deeply on partnerships from across government, academia, and industries. Partnerships with the experts who have the combined technical expertise that was needed to really help pull these publications together in a form that was useful for AI text mining. So we needed those papers then to be available in a data set. So this is where partnerships came into play. We reached out to Georgetown University and National Institutes of Health's National Library of Medicine, and then the Allen AI Institute, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and Microsoft Research, and asked for their help to put these publications make them available in an open research data set. So they volunteered their services and did a lot of things in order to make that happen. And in less than 10 days, they released the COVID-19 Open Research Dataset, which is known as CORD-19. Now, OSTP also worked very closely with scientists from around the world to define a set of key scientific questions that need to be answered in order to learn more about COVID-19 and to identify ways to respond and recover from the virus. So at that time, at the time that the CORD-19 dataset was issued, we also announced a call to action to the AI community in collaboration with Kaggle and posed these scientific questions and made the data set available. So we worked very closely with Kaggle to create the challenge where AI experts can submit tools and techniques that help researchers summarize, analyze, and search the data set for insights. The response has certainly been overwhelming. The COVID-19 data set includes the most comprehensive collection to date of publicly available coronavirus articles available for text and data mining, with currently over 181,000 articles. Over 80,000 of them are full text, and it continues to grow. The data set has been collectively viewed by people from 150 countries. They viewed them over 2 million times, with over 87,000 downloads and over 1,400 AI and text mining-based contributions made. In terms of scientific impact, over 275 scholarly articles have now been published that reference this COVID-19 data set. So I think, these numbers are remarkable and speak very much to the spirit of our innovation ecosystem working together in partnership to address these great challenges. So this is a great example of how public-private partnerships are key. So now let me just very quickly turn to the second use case, which is the COVID-19 High-Performance Computing Consortium. Certainly, people easily recognize that HPC is very important in accelerating certain types of COVID-19 research. So the White House worked in partnership with industry, academia, and government to launch the COVID-19 High-Performance Computing Consortium in March. The consortium pulls together HPC capacity and resources donated from government, industry, and academia. And it provides COVID-19 researchers worldwide with rapid access to the world's most powerful HPC resources. Of course, the goal is to advance the pace of scientific discovery in the fight to stop the virus. So in operation, the HPC consortium matches promising research projects with appropriate computing resources donated by partner organizations. And so in just a few short weeks, the consortium has grown to over 40 members with over 70 active research projects that can access over 600 petaflops of compute on the world's most powerful machines. The consortium is led by DOE and IBM, and the partners include industries like Amazon, AMD, Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Intel, and others. Academics include MIT, RPI, University of Illinois, UT Austin, CMU, University of Pittsburgh, and many others. And it also includes many of the DOE labs, including Argonne, Lawrence Livermore, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Sandia, and so forth. NSF and NASA have also provided resources. Now, this consortium was also highlighted as an outcome in the G7 Science and Technology Ministerial in May, where the G7 ministers noted the importance for researchers around the world to have timely access to advanced computing resources and AI tools needed to solve the world's most pressing scientific problems. And so we have also then developed strong partnerships internationally, with computing resources now also volunteered from the United Kingdom, Japan, Switzerland, Sweden, South Korea, and the EU, all as part of this HPC consortium. So, to summarize, I think these two use cases give excellent examples of how government, industry, and academia can work together to provide critical resources in times of crisis. So what are some lessons learned? Well, some of them are, number one, you can't underestimate the importance of the will to work together to provide these capabilities quickly. Certainly the pandemic provided all the motivation that anyone needed to make these things happen. And actions that might have taken months in the past only took days because everyone agreed with the urgency and importance of the effort. A second lesson is that these use cases worked because the organizers identified key bottlenecks to progress during the crisis and found a mechanism for providing these formerly scarce or difficult to access resources to the research community. And then third, these use cases worked because they empowered the everyday researcher. A much broader base of researchers could benefit from this beyond those who did the actual work or who own the resources. So these resources are available broadly to AI and HPC researchers around the world, and so the effort has a democratizing effect that accelerates the research and increases its impact. Certainly going forward, the question is how to institutionalize these efforts so that they are either maintained as needed or able to be spun up again quickly for the next crisis. I think identifying these ways of leveraging these successes to better prepare for the next crisis is an important next step. So with that, I'll end my remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today. And Greg, I'll give back the floor to you.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. That was perfect and really a very interesting insight into how you've been able to react in the crisis. If you have questions for Lynn, put them into the chat for now, and we're going to have questions after the talks. Now what I'm going to do is turn it over to Guru, and he'll introduce our second speaker.
Thank you so much, Greg. Now it's my treat to introduce Nirav Shah, a distinguished leader in patient safety and quality and a good friend over the years. I've had the pleasure of working with him as the commissioner of the New York State Department of Health. We were thinking or grappling with the problem of setting vaccine priorities. I'm really glad that he's interested in the technologic aspects that we are exploring in this workshop today, and we're delighted to have him here. Nirav is a senior scholar at Stanford University's Clinical Excellence Research Center. He previously served as the senior VP and the chief operating officer for clinical operations for Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, he was the commissioner of the New York State Department of Health. He also serves as a senior fellow of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And he's a member of the HHS Secretary's Advisory Committee on National Health Promotion and Disease Prevention Objectives for 2030. So his participation in this workshop is doubly helpful for us, and perhaps he might be able to take some valuable lessons with him for the important work he's doing. Nirav, of course, is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. Nirav, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Guru, thank you so much. Guru and Greg have suggested that I be provocative, and so I will hopefully deliver on that. And I'm really going to focus on their core question that they started it with. What is the role of research versus industry versus government in accelerating our readiness for the next crisis? And so let me start with research. And we all know that research, the hope is that research has a higher tolerance for risk and also potentially higher reward than some of the other areas that focus on innovation. And for innovation, I'm also thinking about it differently. So invention is the discovery of the principles, and innovation I'm talking about is really the downstream adaptation of those principles for actual use cases. So I'll be talking mostly about innovation, not invention. And when it comes to innovation, we know that we need specialists who have deep expertise, but we also need those generalists. We need people who can cross domains and really bring things from one place to the other. The biologic example serves us well here. We know that recombination is really the principal source upon which variation is used to innovate biologically. Mutation is important, but it's really recombination. It's the mixing of those ideas across fields and domains that lead to the biggest gains over time. And so when we think about research, we need that fragmented governance space. We need the opportunity to explore in different ways without people telling us what to do. And so the role of startups, the agility, the freedom that you get when you're an academic or in some of these environments is really important compared to some of the large corporate bureaucracies that don't always encourage innovation in the same way. It's that open sharing of science that allows innovation to flourish, and that's the role of research. So I want to shift now to where industry focuses on innovation. And industry's role is really to bring that capital and investment to create functioning businesses that address consumer needs, right? We know that industry can be a primary sponsor of research, but how I think about it is that the best industries achieve innovation by achieving elegant integration. It's about combining things into an Apple iPhone that takes 16, 20, 200 different individual things and puts it together in a way that meets consumer needs. What industry does is often very powerful, but we also have to really worry about industry in certain ways. You know, what is Netflix's #1 competitor? Well, they openly say it's sleep. And I'd venture that sleep is losing. You know, today the food industry has created a perfect calorie delivery system using government subsidized corn syrup to make Taco Bell's Doritos Locos Taco Supreme, right? We can't fight industry if they're left to their own devices. So we really need to figure out how do we not let industry who errs toward the quantifiable, short-term, countable, objective, but also think about the longer term, holistic and substantive, and sometimes subjective needs that encompass the greater well-being and population and public health benefits. And so industry has that role that we have to then think about, where does government fit in? And this is where government has a really important role to play. You know, Bill Gates has said that governments need to focus most of their resources on scaling proven solutions. And so while government can certainly help sponsor research and does so well, the problem sometimes occurs in how they sponsored research. I don't think government should be picking winners. I think the government should be defining the rules of the game and defining the desired outcome. Oftentimes, however, when governments rush to do things, they don't think about second order effects. A good example of that happened just recently. Right now, government has said, let's get more testing. So what happens? FDA opens up the rules and we get a lot of really bad tests. And then the pendulum swings backwards, and now they've closed the rules so that even really promising tests out there, individual PCR tests, for example, that are disposable, need to be tested in every single setting where you're going to be using them. So the second order effects of how government acts are very important. Today, government has said we need more testing. So what is the average turnaround time for a test? It's 6 days from Quest and LabCorp and all that, which is absolutely ludicrous and unacceptable and useless for public health purposes, where we need a fast turnaround time. And it's because government has said, we'll pay you $100 for a test. And they haven't said that we'll pay you $20 for a test and $80 if you turn it around within 6 to 12 hours. They've just said, we'll pay you $100 so people can hoard tests and say, you know, they have capacity, but I'll get paid $100. So I'm going to keep the test to myself. And the system is broken because of the second order effects that government created unwillingly. So government has an outsized role in thinking about competition, the rules of the game. You know, California has done well in many ways because we have non-compete agreements are not allowed. And so people jump from Google to Amazon to Facebook to other places and share ideas. Those are the kinds of things that government can set the rules of how the game works and make a longer term difference in much more important ways than the short term. The 2 or 3 areas I'd love for us to discuss in the work groups are around public good versus private benefit. You know, I think we can have both. The Amazons of the world can also create a lot of public good if we set the rules right and allow the sharing and the environment to go. Another area I want to talk about is about equity and inclusion and diversity. You know, we know that there are the recent movements you've seen, there is so much good to be had if we include other voices at the table in different ways, and that structurally we've failed on many levels, from science to Silicon Valley elsewhere, to really include other voices. I'd love to think about how do we set the rules differently so that we actually become more inclusive as we approach the challenges we face. I'll stop there. Thank you, Guru.
Nirav, thank you. Your points resonate at many levels. In fact, they have such general purpose validity on so many things that we're confronting during this pandemic. I'll turn it to Greg to introduce our next distinguished speaker.
Great, thank you, Guru. Well, it's really a pleasure to be able to introduce Bill Brody as our final speaker. Bill is somebody who I have known and admired for over 20 years now. He was, in fact, president of Johns Hopkins when I joined the institution, but he has a very long and illustrious career, which I think is also exactly emblematic of what Guru was talking about as a generalist who hits many areas. Bill did his undergrad and master's work at MIT in electrical engineering, but he got his MD and PhD from Stanford. He eventually rose to be chair of radiology here at Johns Hopkins and eventually president of the university before going to be president of the Salk Institute, from which he retired just a few years ago. Along the way, Bill founded several med tech companies, and in fact, I think he's still serving on the board of a couple of those companies. He's also a member of both the National Academies of Medicine and Engineering. So I think you can see Bill really exemplifies this notion of a physician scientist, an innovator, but somebody who's also able to think at a very global level within large organizations. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his remarks, and I will turn it over to you, Bill.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So I have some bad news. Just a minute ago, I discovered that I had a cyber attack and I lost my talk. That's the bad news. The good news is Professor Shah gave my talk, and I think he must have lifted it from me, because some of the points he made I wanted to make, but he made them more eloquently and in a bit more detail. So I'm actually not sure what I should say, but I'll start with apologies for repetition. I think, with apologies to Nirav, the number one lesson of SARS-CoV-19 is that there are products and systems that are needed for the public good, whether it's healthcare, PPE, ventilators, and they cannot be provided solely by the private sector. And that's hard for somebody who believed in capitalism and thought that efficient markets would work. But in fact, there are times when the financial rewards don't benefit the investment of capital. We already know that robotic systems are increasingly playing a role in healthcare delivery. I'm on the board of Stanford Healthcare. They just built a brand new hospital to replace their earthquake susceptible old hospital. And if you walk in there, you're going to get run over by robots more than by anybody else. So we're in this age where we're going. I think just to again emphasize the role of government and the public not-for-profit sectors, really to provide policies, number one, that will advance the public good and to fund activities that promote protection from harm, whether that's the military, CDC, NIH, FEMA, and so forth, FDA, HHS. Our role in academia is to make discoveries and invention through research and development. And it's inventions and discoveries. Sometimes the discoveries and often are not purpose-driven science, but they're serendipitous in a way. And the role of industry is to innovate. These are exactly what Nirav said, to take discoveries and inventions from academia or from wherever, their own internal R&D, and produce products that can solve market needs at scale. And what I've observed during COVID is the number of engineers and small companies have gotten involved saying, we can solve this problem or that problem. And they either don't have the ability to scale or they get blocked by requirements. So just one example, I think that was kind of alluded to yesterday, frequently you have to interface with healthcare systems, electronic health records, and you run into the fact that the EHRs are closed systems and they're not friendly to people interfacing, and that becomes an expensive task. And then you layer on HIPAA, FDA requirements, Medicare requirements, and so forth, and it becomes a nearly impossible task. One thing I think we need to rethink is providing faster vehicles for people to get approval and relief for some of but without going to complete chaos, which I think happened with the FDA and emergency use authorization. I think really focusing on what can government do well, and I agree, government now is investing a lot of money, but they're trying to pick winners, which may work in certain areas and it may not work in other areas. I think their approach to vaccines is an interesting one. I think vaccines went, as I think Zeke Emanuel pointed out yesterday, went from being no man's land for private investment to being considered now after successful vaccines hit the market. as a good area to invest. But it's difficult for government to pick winners. And I think emphasizing high risk is great for NIH, but I'm not sure how the government can lay that out. So I'm going to stop there and just say I'm happy to weigh in and to questions and the discussion. I think this is a really important area for research, and I think we need to be sure that the right kind of capital is going into research and development of new technologies that can then be handed off to industry for innovation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bill. And I think working without a script, you do outstandingly well. So thank you for your remarks. So we now have a little bit of time for discussion. I know we're going to go to breakouts, but I'd like to give us a little bit of a chance just to reflect on these talks. So again, if you have thoughts, please put them into the chat and we can relay them to the speakers. Just maybe to get that discussion going, one of the things that I think seems to be a common theme across all of the remarks today is this notion of government as, in some sense, setting the ground rules or providing framing, but not necessarily trying to define a solution. But at the same time, you can create a space, but you've got to get people to inhabit the space. Now, Lynn, in your talk, you said, well, COVID actually drove a lot of innovation that might not have happened, or a lot of progress that might not have happened without a crisis. But how do we create these spaces with malice aforethought, and how do we drive people or move companies and researchers into those spaces without having a crisis to drive us? I'm curious, maybe one of the speakers could pick up on that. I'm going to pick on Nirav just because you're the one who kind of said you wanted to be provocative and set the ground rules. So how do we think ahead and plan ahead as opposed to wait for a crisis to cause us to finally react?
Well, we know what we should do. For example, the kind of tabletops that we used to do when I was commissioner preparing for hurricanes helped us when Hurricane Sandy hit. We had already talked to all the players. We know the basic principles of what to do for disasters, what to do for major events. We knew what we should have been doing around COVID. There was a big tabletop that happened with the old administration to the new one that didn't really result in the kind of outputs that we needed. So it's not about whether we know or not what we need to do. It's about how do we follow through on it. And I'd love to hear what Bill and others have to say on this as well. Mm-hmm.
Very good. We have a number of questions coming in, and keep them coming. I think we can even take them to the breakout sessions here. One question from our chief organizer here, Russ Taylor, talks about there's a comment that academia can produce inventions and new knowledge, but academia's main produce is actually educated students. What is the role here in training engineers and scientists who can work in innovation and transition to scale deployments or mobilization? So I think that's a question pertaining to how do you get good at translation and scale up, and how best equipped modern academia is. So maybe Bill, do you want to take a shot?
Yeah, so I apologize to Russ for not saying this, because I've always said that education is the primary product of universities, even though it may end up in patents and papers. Chuck Vest, when he was president of MIT, said the best vehicle for tech transfer is the moving van. And I think, really inventions are important, but they're not important as they're not helpful or as useful without, in general, having the innovator go along with it, which is typically a graduate student. And the other thing that I would say is, in the old days, and I know some universities have these, but not as many, there used to be co-op programs where students would go out and work in industry as part of their requirements for their degree. And I think this would be a wonderful way to get students involved in the medical device industry, which has become sort of a forgotten path because of particularly the FDA requirements and Medicare reimbursement requirements have been so difficult. That has really moved people away from that into health tech or biotech. So I think I would suggest that. Maybe that's going on today since I'm 10 years out of date at Hopkins, Russ.
Yeah, it is, but not maybe enough. So thank you very much for that. I stole that line from you long ago.
Lynn, this question is for you. How is the government investment being informed today by the needs of the health system, and should this mechanism change?
Well, if you think about investments in general, I mean, obviously you have more long-term investments, and certainly the role of the federal government is to continue to maintain those long-term investments, because obviously there's not necessarily an industry driver to explore the entire space. So I think certainly you don't want the investments to swing, from year to year too radically because of the need to maintain these long-term investments. At the same time, I think it's up to the agencies that have the expertise in the various areas. So in this case, the NIH, for instance, to define what are the areas that have high priority when it comes to particular needs. And certainly at the administration level, there's always the R&D budget priorities memo that lays out at a super high level the areas of strategic emphasis that should be focused on within the next year. So I think it's a combination of things. It's a combination of having a long-term perspective, recognizing that today's crisis, we can address it, but it'll be a different crisis in a year or two. And so we need to have all the bases covered to the extent possible. The experts at the agencies can help define what those areas are, both for now and going into the future. And then strategically, we can help address the priorities of agencies in their budgets, given that you can't invest in everything all the time, and trying to balance that long-term need and the short-term need.
Very good. I think we have very effectively succeeded here in having a rich discussion. I think I went a little bit over time with this session, but that's okay. We're taking a more relaxed Friday approach here. I do have a couple of questions from others, which we can save for the regrouping after the breakouts. So Russ, may I turn it over to you, or Helen perhaps here to get us to the breakouts here? I think in the
I think actually if Guru, if you and Greg or Helen maybe
I could show the slides, we can get the breakouts going.
Got it.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So so again, thank you very much for really inspiring opening remarks from our speakers. Our goal is now to go to breakouts, reflect on what we've heard from the speakers, and start to think a little bit about how we can match the problem space that has really been exposed by COVID, but by the broader class of infectious diseases, how we can connect technology and solutions using technology into that space, in particular thinking about how academic research, industry, and government can do that, and in particular how we can accelerate readiness for the next crisis. If you go to the next slide, Helen. I'd already put up these 4 questions that we'd like you to think about in the breakouts, thinking about mechanisms, policy opportunities, network creation, and also communication. I just, again, want to emphasize, I think it's easy for us in this virtual room to have a conversation and to understand the needs and the directions, be excited about it, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be translated to action unless we can communicate those needs. So we really need to think about communication mechanisms along with a lot of the other innovations that we're thinking about. So please think creatively about how that could be done as well. For this breakout, we've changed things up a bit. We have just 2 breakouts this time. So it'll be a little bit of a larger group. So maybe on the one hand, a little bit more challenging to manage, but maybe also an opportunity for a little bit more chatter in the chat window and through the breakout group. So with that, I know we're running a little late, so if you're a breakout leader, hopefully you can let your breakout run maybe a few minutes long into the break, just so people have a chance to respond. And then we need to be back in this main room at 1 o'clock for the report outs. So with that, Maddie has put the breakout links into the chat, and you should be able to, you should have gotten an email, I believe, which tells you which breakouts you're in. But for all practical purposes, you know, get into one of them, get a discussion going. There should be a breakout leader and scribes who will be managing that breakout. So again, thank you everybody for this plenary session. I will look forward to seeing you back here at 1 o'clock, full of ideas that have emerged in the breakouts.
And please join Greg and me in giving our speakers a virtual applause.
Thank you so much.
Should I send one of the breakout links if she wants to join one, or?
Be used for other things that are much more in the public good, and being very focused and direct in thinking through this dual use. And so how do you do that? It could be that there is, the funding is associated, at least with academics, about, hey, as part of your funding, think about dual use abilities with respect to a new development or technologies that are already out there that you are designing new algorithms around. And so really it's this aspect of dual use from the beginning, so that you're not trying to mature technology when the crisis happens. All you're doing is trying to retrofit current technology for a high critical use, such as we have now. So for the next one, which is the policy opportunities, one of the weaknesses is that as academic researchers, we traditionally, or even researchers in general, typically don't get into policy aspects. And most of the individuals that are making policies are not the ones that are doing the research. And so some of the conversation was, what are these opportunities? How do we push for something different? So there was some discussion about convening things like a physician board was one mention, where you have a board of experts that are actually advising some of the policymakers. Of course, that requires us to rethink what we do and what our job function is as researchers. Policy has to be then part of our job description, and we have to internalize that in order for that to actually happen. The other, which is fostering a network of creating and convening to identifying, that linked a lot to education. It also linked to this aspect of, we're not really good at communicating in general. We're pretty bad about communicating what we're doing, and therefore, how do we create a network outside of our own eco bubble or ecosystem? And so some thoughts are having a two things. One is thinking through a dual purpose committee. So just like you have dual use technologies, thinking about how do you create networks of policymakers, roboticists, ethicists, and whoever is part of the stakeholder, where they're addressing the current problems, but as part of that practice, they're also talking about the next. That also allows it to maintain and continue through, so that you're not all of a sudden having to deal with a crisis. The other was, and this is with robotics need, and this came up, which is a little bit of a segue, is even if we're talking about it now, what happens if we create a network now? What happens 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 2 years from now, where we forget, you know, we're on the other side? How do we then continue the things that we're doing now? And so one mention was, if you remember, hospitals have emergency drills every, say, 6 months. As school kids, we have, unfortunately, shooter drills now. Why is that? Because it's a preparation and everyone hates it, but you know it's your part of your life. And so thinking through, is there something that you can add to these kinds of networks where every 6 months you talk about the next crisis as part of the conversation? You may not like, it's like, yeah, I'm tired of this, but it also means that you're prepared as a network for quickly convening and having solutions when the next crisis happens. And maybe it doesn't happen, which is a good thing, but if it does, you at least have that network that's available and prepared and has already talked about the needs. And then the last, which was, how do you communicate the impact of technology development policy changes? One of the interesting outputs or thoughts is, how can we create like a Supta Gupta for robotics, or a celebrity spokesperson, for example, Will Smith, or even Jeff Bloomberg, that, right, like presents it, like they have a voice. And we see this in a lot of other efforts that have gone on in terms of, for example, health and kids, like Michelle Obama got behind one of those efforts. Why not? Why can't we do that with someone where they can communicate what robotics is, what it's capable of, getting people excited, but also can talk about things that we're doing in terms of technology. And also, we know that that also helps influence policy, because people are behind the letter writing and things like that. And so that was just kind of a thought. And it was like, yeah, why not? Why don't we do that? So that kind of summarizes, again, there was a lot of stuff, but that summarizes some of the things I thought was different in terms of the conversation.
Excellent. I think that's a great summary. I was in that breakout, and you know, I think those are exactly the themes that I heard come out. And I can see in the chat window there's a lot of resonance around this dual use idea. So I think that's something that once we get done with the breakouts, we can move on to maybe discuss a little bit more. But before doing that, how about if I turn us over to breakout number 2? And that was, I think, George, you were in charge of that?
Yes. We had a very rich discussion, and actually some of the themes align with what the other group discussed. We first talked about the barriers, and clearly the payers have been perceived as a barrier in terms of deploying and disseminating innovation in clinical settings. There's also the barrier of trying to deploy something in a clinical environment because of the rules and the regulations that vary from one side to another so drastically. Michelle made a good point about the differences in regulations, for example, between a PACE center, a hospital, a nursing home facility, or home care. And it might be difficult for the technologists to try and navigate this policy landscape on their own. So we talked about the need to have a network of policymakers, technologies, and healthcare systems that come together to more proactively identify robotic needs or the role of robotics in a crisis. We also talked about how there's need for the robotics community to set standards, and that this would be the first step in terms of trying to facilitate interoperability. We also talked about the lessons learned that we have so far from COVID, and how it would be important to create a library of case studies that demonstrate individual success stories and lessons learned. There's been so many initiatives globally that have been perhaps at smaller scale, but now we have, unfortunately, a living experiment as the whole planet is going through this. So trying to document in a more detail what those case studies are can be an ever-growing library and a repository that can help us perhaps be more ready for the next crisis. We also talked about the idea of having a network of clinical sites that would be willing to become early adopters. So they would become like an incubator for ideas or a sounding board where technologists, policymakers, and these clinical sites would partner and would deploy innovative tools there first. This would have to be conceptualized in a way that would be a win-win situation. Maybe these clinical sites are at the forefront and therefore they get to keep the technology or they get to be at the cutting edge. but that would be kind of a living laboratory for ideas and tools to be deployed fast. We talked about the importance for the government to prioritize and provide shareable infrastructure for robotics. And then the last part of our conversation focused around education. We talked a lot about how do we train the next generation of scientists. So for the technology side, perhaps there is more that can be done in terms of integrating some of the policy aspects into the curriculum. But then similarly, perhaps there is time for the health professions to more readily embrace robotics in some capacity as an exposure in their curriculum too. Not in terms of them becoming roboticists, but perhaps be more prepared to become intelligent consumers of these tools and maybe foster that interprofessional dialogue earlier on in undergraduate and graduate education. I think that's pretty much it, the key points. We had a lot of discussion around each of these points, but I tried to summarize them just to give you a broad overview of the conversation that we had.
That's great. A lot of really interesting themes that popped out in there. You know, with this, maybe Guru, I'll turn it over to you and let you maybe moderate a little bit of the discussion around this.
Sure, absolutely. And we welcome any questions here, but maybe as a warm up, here's something to think about. And this is not a subject that I think day to day at work, but I'm wondering, I know the United States has been, in terms of preparedness or lack thereof, been somewhat notorious in the kind of the trends that we're displaying with the COVID-19. But I wonder if any of you might be able to share reflections or learnings from what our colleagues in other countries like Japan and South Korea have been doing, just as a point of reference to help us scale our ambitions accordingly.
You know, I can speak on Taiwan. I know that pretty well. It all starts with testing. You know, you can't even start talking about anything else until we do testing right. And we shouldn't be talking about contact tracing. We shouldn't be talking about anything until we get testing done. Right now, we're on a herd immunity strategy, just like Sweden and Brazil, whether we admit to it or not. And all our resources collectively need to get testing done.
So Nira, while I have you online, this was a question I wanted to ask earlier, but lack of time prevented it. In the spirit of the discussion we're having and the technological capacity that we are building our confidence around, and you have a lot of scar tissues dealing with the policy realities, especially in the New York State, which was affected big time by the pandemic. But I'm wondering, in terms of the possibilities and from what our colleagues have been talking in breakouts and yesterday, if it's a pure hypothetical, if you might eventually end up in a scenario where you basically have a Jiffy Lube type testing approach. You go there, wait for test results, 3 hours, 2 hours, depending on the complexity of your situation, simple oil change, whatever, and then you walk away, because 6 days seems appalling. From, I think I share your concern about that. This is no way to prepare for something.
Yeah, I mean, the antigen tests that are being developed right now are promising, but they still are 85% sensitivity. They're not the high levels that we need. There are thoughtful strategies that we should be employing that were used in other places. While like 50 people work on the second floor, they all spit into a cup. You do one test on that with a quick turnaround time. If it's positive, everyone goes home and you do deep cleaning. That way you get, you know, there's thoughtful ways that we should be reopening our economy. Clearly, we're prioritizing opening up bars over opening up schools. We're doing a lot wrong. We need leadership. We really need true leadership, which we don't have.
Other reflections, reactions, thoughts here?
As I noted in the chat window, this notion of dual use is, I think, something that seems to have elicited a lot of interest. And again, just to frame this, you know, the idea is that rather than thinking of developing a technology de novo when a crisis appears, what you want to do is to already have that technology in some sense quasi on the shelf, perhaps in another form, but be able to pivot it to what you need to do in the moment. So, you know, the idea of reprioritizing agricultural robots to do disinfection is a great example of this. And I'm wondering if, you know, I'm starting to think ahead to the report that we're going to write, and having concrete examples where dual use has been effective in the past and where government could play a role in incentivizing the development of dual use technologies would be super helpful. So I don't know if anybody has examples to relate of that sort of dual use or government incentivization of technology development that could be deployed in that sense. But I'd be interested to hear those stories if anybody has them, or concrete ideas of directions you think we should point to in dual use.
Well, one place where you hear the term a lot is with military, although it's often things like export control and the like. But that probably is one area that I don't know if there are people here. I don't think we have a DoD person with us, but that certainly would be one area where we could begin to think about. At least they have experience with that.
Indeed, Russ, and I think that's where the intelligence community is really well equipped. They are so good at organizing interagency work groups and so forth. And it appears to me that, even based on the conversation just today, that this is simultaneously of interest not just to CMS from reimbursement perspective, but also NIST, the pivotal role of standard setting we were talking about, and even private groups such as ANSI, ISO, and IEEE in this case. So a lot of standard setting bodies that could promote voluntary consensus based approaches here that Bill Brody was talking about from radiology examples. So it's not just the group of independent policy advisors that are essential, but also an interagency group. And I think OSTP's official role is just that. And I know some of our colleagues here, I mean, during the previous administration, there were a number of interagency groups on climate, energy, and whatnot. And I think that is an available mechanism to capitalize on.
Okay, no, that sounds really good. You know, the dual use also relates to something that also came up, and George mentioned very briefly from our work group, which are sort of standard modules. If you're talking about a dual use technology that you're going to adapt to something, to make it easily done, you need to have certain parts of your design kind of certified as to what the interface is. I mean, I'm talking engineer geek speak here, but and you know, part of maybe incentivizing, you can imagine a robot for dual use where part of the certification might be a tooling interface that you're not going to use right away, but that has some standard that if, especially if you thought about how I might use it in a crisis, it's sort of there, and the main system part is on the other side already. On the other hand, that cost a company, say, developing a product, time. So that's part of the story. And then the other part is sort of dual use between industry and academia. And that's where I think you could imagine a industrial strength version of ROS as an example. There are beginning to see things in medical imaging like that, where you have this sort of de facto standard that evolved very rapidly, and a lot of people are doing things. But if at least some parts then could be just industrialized enough so that you could safely put them into a medical system, that seems like that'd be very useful.
I got
mechanisms, right? I guess I just wanted to point out that you know, Chris Hauser pointed out that, for example, you could imagine mechanisms around SBIRs that set aside a pot of funding specifically for development toward dual use. And the other thing I think that's interesting about that is this idea that George mentioned about clinical sites that would be designated early adopters.
Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, I think what I feel like we need to do is we need to create kind of parallel connected networks between technology and the healthcare space or the application space. I mean, it could be lab automation as well. It doesn't have to be healthcare per se, but you know, there has to be that network in place, and that becomes the funnel that takes early technology plus some incentivization, makes it possible to quickly translate it into the domain space that we're interested in. And that could be a set of programs and policies that one could put in place.
Very good.
Go ahead.
Now, Ayana, in the chat window, put something interesting and about agricultural robotics and dual use. Do you want to say a little bit more, Ayana, about what you heard and processed?
Well, no. So you had asked, Greg had asked about examples, but I think a perfect example, well, not perfect. So when there was this projection we would be out of ventilators, and based on government intervention and some other things beforehand, some of the manufacturing companies went through the process of I'm making cars. Well, the equipment's sort of the same. It has to be retooled a little bit differently. People need to be trained, but too late. But anyway, that's an example of a dual use, something that was already done and out there. I think if we had been thinking through this, say 3 years ago, of how to do it more effectively, like, hey, all of our manufacturers that are out there, how would you ramp them up in terms of tool sets and robotics to deal with the crisis? We would have been more prepared, and it was a delta because it involved government intervention.
Ayana, I can say something about making ventilators fast because we did just that. And I will say that the process was very complex. I mean, getting a ventilator that meets medical standards is challenging and also costly. So we did an emergency ventilation prototype, which we tested with pigs and with doctors. And we got to the point where we had a company lined up to help support manufacturing. This was a startup. We also approached major companies because we were using their motors. And in the beginning, everyone was very excited about, yes, we're going to do it. And then it was time and it was money, and there were supply chain issues. And I would say that everyone more or less dropped out. So the good news is that the ventilators made their way. The ventilation systems made their way into New York. We have a startup in New York that took the open source documents and turned them into a product. We had to support that process significantly. We have a few other companies around the world who are working on their own version based on the MIT open source documents, but it's not as simple as just flipping a switch. The amount of time involved in providing support for the manufacturers is huge. And what I have found is that ultimately, if the companies don't see an actual immediate benefit, they will not step up in the way that's necessary. And that's the reality.
Yeah, and I guess this is the example of a dual use, right? Like there's this aspect of a dual use is not just like taking ag robotics and saying, hey, we can do it. But with planning, and that was one of the things that kept mentioning, a lot of this is about planning. It's about having the plans that are already online, that you know exactly okay, this is going to be an issue in terms of the supply chain. This is going to be the cost. So that when you do get to that point where, we need to do X, it's not having to figure it out from like ground zero kind of thing. It's we have all the planning and these are the holes. And so that's really the concept of this dual use, is how do you make it so that when you don't need it, it's still being used, but you also know how to convert it to the high critical need when you need it, not, 3 months after when it's, we're skyrocketing in terms of when we really do need to have it.
Very good. Nirav raised a really interesting question about setting some overarching principles to shape our recommendations or priorities here. Nirav, would you want to say a little bit more about? I think that's an insightful point.
I think we're starting to converge. It sounds like a lot of our ideas are getting together, and we may be able to come up with a framework that would be broadly applicable to how we organize and prioritize our work. So I just suggested, repeated back, that we're talking a lot about dual use. We're talking a lot about open source. We're talking about standard setting. Are there 3 to 5 principles that will provide boundaries for the work we do, or how we think about our recommendations?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not quite sure how to articulate broadly. One other thing, Guru, that we kind of passed over that I think is something maybe would be worth people talking about.
Please.
Is this notion of a network of early adopters. If you're going to do that to promote kind of rapid development, one of the barriers is, from the point of view of the academics, suddenly you get to the point where there's sort of real sort of clinical engineering involved and things like that, that traditionally academia has not been good at. And hospitals typically don't really have the budget to support it. And if I look at my impression of NIH funding right now, is it very strongly either goes to clinical trials or to sort of science and innovation or invention. I think if you're going to have this network, there needs to somewhere be some support for the professional engineering staff that will enable it to fulfill its mission quickly. Things for the inventors to very quickly get done the things that they're not good at, and the working with the end users in this early adoption network.
But isn't that kind of the national lab model?
Say again?
Isn't that kind of the national lab model? I was just thinking about this, and I mean,
I'm
talking about is a little bit like what the national labs are designed.
Yeah, Greg, that is actually one of the thoughts that came to my mind. Or you can imagine something like a NIH P41 type, except here we're talking more of a net. Yeah, there are models. I think we part of what needs to happen is we need to look at those models, see what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate for this particular kind of mission. But I mean, there are other things like the universities and the hospitals need to be a little less paranoid thinking they're going to make $1 billion off of some invention. You'll need to have some way of getting people a little less paranoid about that. Anyhow, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Guru, you've dealt, and maybe some of the other government people can comment more on that.
Indeed, please add to the thoughts here. I know there's a lot of discussion happening about open source, closed source, or tagging on to open source platforms. So anyone wants to take a lead on this? Maybe Vijay, yourself?
I see Robin is commenting a lot in the chat window. Robin, you want to just...
My apologies, yeah.
Talk Robin, but you're popping in there.
Oh, great, right, yeah. I really like, oops, I almost had it there. Yeah, what a great discussion, and I like the technology thing. The one thing I would throw up about the national laboratories is that from my experience with national laboratories, they're not broad enough to deal with what we're seeing. If you're talking about just healthcare, and just healthcare, that would be acute healthcare or maybe nursing homes, yeah, but they don't do the laboratory automation side, and they don't do delivery, which has been split pretty evenly between drones and ground robots. And the biggest user of robots right now, the biggest application that we are seeing reported is actually public safety, which includes public works for outdoor disinfecting subways and stuff. So I think it really, we can't give it to a national network, and we can't give it to the Department of Homeland Security because it is not done very well with that. I mean, so anyway, that was I think the gist of what I was writing about.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, but there is some notion of creating, if you're going to have a network, say of public safety or disaster relief, or network of cities, there needs to be places that can help provide this extra level of glue. I mean, what I'm most familiar with, of course, is sort of clinical systems, but you're right. There probably needs to be ways of enabling several of these networks, but I think in the end you're going to need some government subsidy if you're going to do it.
I certainly think we should never say no to money and development and incentives, but where would it come from and really do that?
Well, that's the challenge. The country needs to solve that, I think.
Yeah. And looking at Chris's statement that existing platforms are good for homes and outdoors, but need for clinical use. Yeah, but let's not forget those workplace, education, and home use. Those can be profound as we get people back to work. I mean, look at the increases that we've seen in workplace automation. And these are things that aren't necessarily taking jobs away from people. I mean, we can get into that whole side there, but they're definitely going to help.
Robin, since I have you in our previous conversations, you have really duly emphasized the role of robotics in public safety. And I don't think that quite came out in greater intensity during this workshop. I was wondering if you might add or expand upon some of your thoughts there, fire sanitation and whatnot.
Right, we've been keeping up with reports in the press, which would possibly over and under report different types of robotics technology. But if you look at 23 that describe, I mean, 203 discrete, not with duplicates where everything got retweeted, of postings from around the world, from 32 countries. What we're seeing is that 74 of those instances are in public safety. 45 are in clinical care. And then it starts getting spread out evenly between work and education, home, personal life stuff, and then laboratory automation and in nursing home, corporate care, that sort of thing. So when you start looking at that 74, almost twice as much as in public safety. Now that may be the nature of visibility and what journalists like to report, and the general population can see that more than they can see a robot that's cleaning the hospital rooms and making it possible to handle the surge capacity for COVID. So there's some possibilities there. But it does indicate that there are more than just acute care that we need to be thinking, any opportunities, and we need to make sure that's available to them. If we start looking at the different types of robots, so most robots in disasters, and that's my area, I've been studying disasters since 1995, will be mature technologies, both physically mature and mature within that use category, which NASA calls technical readiness assessment versus a technical readiness level. All right, so most of those have been there. And then the ones that are engineering, which only have one thing that has to be tweaked, they either for a new mission, that would be the dual use, or they need one widgety thing changed, that would be an engineering use. Those are taking things like turtle bots and slapping something on it, or they're taking a cart and slapping a universal robot arm on it. So we're already seeing some standards and some things emerge.
Very good. Any other comments, questions, reflections as we wrap up the breakout reporting here? Let me also keep an eye on the chat here. Any burning comments? Any points we have missed? Any points we're not thinking deeply enough? Greg, from you?
No, I think it's been a great
Yeah.
conversation, and it seems like there are some themes that definitely have emerged from this, and I think Brian actually did a really nice job of capturing them, and I think they're things that we can build on as we start to move towards the report. Maybe what we could do at this point is do a pivot to Russ, and Russ could talk a little bit about what the next steps are and how we're going to actually try to capture the content from this workshop.
Sure. Yeah, hi. Okay, now for our homework. But first, let me again thank the everybody, and also I'm really thrilled. We still have 36 participants, and people who've had experience with this kind of workshop, you often expect to melt, and I think it probably is a tribute to the importance of this subject that that people have really stayed engaged, and even those who had to leave for various reasons seem to have regretted it. So if what we're going to do, other than have a nice memory of a great, interesting couple days, is we need to take what we've done and get it into a report. And in fact, when we proposed this workshop, we said that the goal is, in fact, to outline a report and a strategy. And as Guru mentioned, one of our hopes is that there can be some good recommendations already, but also that people will realize that this is a subject and an opportunity that can lead to more, and that we can make a more intensive effort, even as we're going to define and improve a strategy, even as we're going forward with whatever actions can be taken based on what we've already learned. So our goal is to write a report, and there are various ways. It's going to be a challenge to digest all of the material that's come forward. But in the end, what we chose to do is we've set up a template document, I'll show you in a moment, that really to organize your input, your material, and tie it to the 5 questions that we said would be the subject of the report. And one of the things, and we're going to ask you to provide input. In fact, we're going to ask you to provide input between now and Monday, if at all possible. But when you do that, think about short term. Well, what can we do in the next 18 months? Kind of middle term, sort of a 1.5 to 5 years, and then longer term things. Key challenges. What can the technology responses be? What are the knowledge barriers? What are the workforce training needs and opportunities? And what could be done right now? What might take a couple years to get organized? And what in the long term would we really like to see on an ongoing basis? In thinking about this, we also realized that in some cases, here, could you go to the next slide, Helen? That it's often useful as well to think in terms of a traditional strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat analysis. And so in our document, we've also provided a place where people can add their thoughts using this framework. And you kind of have your choice, or you can do both. And if we go to the next slide, there are a couple points I do want to emphasize. This is actually just what the template document looks like. It's a Google document that people can basically suggest edits to. Don't edit it. There's a mode in Google Docs that says make suggestions. So this is what that document looks like. So you'll see, a topic, and then basically a place for bullets. and just simply identify, identify yourself so we know it's not it's primarily so we can follow up with you if we want to get some more clarification, and then bullet point, short sentences, short paragraphs, whatever you want. And from this, and again, ideally, we want the feedback. I guess you can go to the next slide, Helen. By Monday, we really want some input. If there's any way you can do it, ideally even right after this, we have sort of time for writing. But whenever we're looking to get material, and then the organizers and the staff will be trying to organize this into some form, and then I'm hoping basically by the end of the month, or maybe the first week of August, to have a draft that we can be getting out to people for comment and additional suggestions, and then we'll be able to promulgate it. And I'm hoping people like Guru and the CCC and NSF and so forth will be able to make use of it. And if we go to the next slide. So here is the magic link. Can you also put that in the chat, Helen, or someone? If you can put the magic link into the chat, that would be great. Are you able to do that? If not, I can here. Let me. To everyone. Okay. Here is a link. I don't see all the HTTP stuff, but that is the link. As I said, it should be in the point of make suggestions. There's an option in the website that makes suggestions. Don't go actually. You kind of, it shows as a suggestion, and then Helen will do overall editorial control in making sure things are merged and don't step on each other and accidentally delete each other and so forth. But again, we really want to have that by Monday, if at all possible, because we've got a lot of work to do to take all of this terrific input and turn it into something that is reasonably concise and coherent. If we can go to the next, well, before I go
Russ, before you do, Russ,
yeah.
This
Sure.
is Anne. I just want to add a couple of comments. So one of the key things that the CCC does is we put out these reports for the community, by the community, and that really is a key thing. We chose not to just, we wanted everyone's input. So this report writing, while all virtual, is a bit different because we're trying to get the broader community sense, not just the organizers and so forth. So we really do want your input, but as other people are writing, if there are ways you want to add on to what someone has said, please, like Russ said, suggest comments to their things or agreement and go on from there. Because while we're not sitting together and discussing what we're going to write per se, ideally you're drawing on your experience from the past 2 days and the conversations you've had and heard and are putting stuff there. And as Russ said, the reason we want your names is so that we can say, oh, Robin and Russ both seem to agree on this. Maybe the two of them can elucidate this paragraph a bit more so that we can come back to you for that community input. But the final report will be on behalf of all of us. It will have every attendee's name in it, and it will never say, Russ says that we should do this. It will be what this group, and I want everyone to realize, because that to me is really important in the work that we're doing.
Look, I completely agree, and thank you. Thank you for reminding that this really is a community effort. Everyone's name is on it, and no one's going to come back on any individual thing and say, oh, you said this, I don't agree. It really is supposed to represent the consensus of a representative group of the community as to what we think and where things might go. So thank you very much. And are there other comments that the other organizers have before we go on to the next slide?
The one other thing I will say to add on to that is whenever we do a visioning workshop, we do say as we come to the end that, you know, this isn't the end because we've got to get this report out and share the ideas. So hopefully everyone will work a bit while the ideas are fresh and write some of your initial thoughts for us to then pull together. But also when we do have the draft report and we ask for your input on it, please, please, please take that opportunity as well. That's how we ensure that it's by the community.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one other thing just to quickly add, one of the often the challenges here too is we want to talk about this in a grounded fashion. So if you have citations to articles that have already been published that talk about strategic directions or citations that ground the need for advances in certain areas, those are most welcome because the more that we can make this not just a set of opinions, but a set of opinions that are based in the current state of science, the current state of the literature, the stronger the report will be. So please, if you can put citations in or suggested citations, that's also helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I meant to add that to the slide and we forgot. But yes, please, there will be an extensive bibliography as well. And VJ and Robin, do you have anything to add? Or Daniela?
I think you covered everything.
It looks great. We really would like to capture everyone's great ideas, and so I suggest that while people still have the discussion fresh in their minds, they take a little bit of time and provide the input, because it's very important we create a powerful report.
Yeah, there'll be we'll keep as well the Zoom link open, but we will there's a writing time at least for those who in the afternoon here. VJ, were you going to say something or?
No, just that I thought you covered everything. I thought, you know, a lot of good ideas. I particularly like the the discussion on standardization and perhaps, a taxonomy of problems. I think if you can make some thoughtful recommendations as to how to view that, I think that would be a great contribution of this workshop.
Sure. And Robin, did you want to add anything or?
No, I think this is just so exciting to see everybody come together, and it seems like we are moving in the same direction. Just think the more specific we can be, the easier it is to write an impactful report, so that it's not just a, hey, we need to do this. But so I would ask everybody to err on the side of being too specific, because it'll be easier to work backwards rather than add more.
Well, that's a good point. Okay, well, why don't we go to the next slide, and following which we'll have sort of an open mic discussion for a while. But before we went that, because some people I fear we may lose, I really wanted to take the opportunity on behalf of all of the organizers to thank everybody. Obviously our sponsors, the National Academy of Engineering and the CCC have been utterly amazing in helping us get this started. Sometimes it took a while, but actually it was very quick, and they were very, very supportive. And so we thank them greatly. Logistical support was provided by the CCC. And I can't begin to say enough about Helen Wright. She's been just beyond amazing. And people have seen a little of it, but behind the scenes, there's just an amazing thing that she did. So Helen, you could either show your face or here you are. And so thank you very, very much. And also there are other people, Carrie and Maddie from CCC. Also, you've seen, for instance, them in the chat. And again, it kind of takes at least a small village even to put together a small workshop. So thank you. the student note takers, these were medical students and engineering students from our institutions. And again, you guys have provided an amazing insight, and you guys are the future generation. In a few years, when the next crisis hits, it may be you on the spot to deal with it. So thank you so much. And obviously, on a personal basis, I want to thank my fellow organizers. A workshop kind of grew out initially of some discussions I had with Guru, but it was obvious that we needed more than one person. And so just on a personal basis, Vijay, Robin, Greg, Daniela, thank you. And finally, all of you. There's still 36 people here. We were talking about popcorn popping and earlier as people trickled in, but thank you so much. And now we have the opportunity. What I'd like to do is turn it over to Guru, because we do have some time before we lose people, for people just to add additional thoughts about the day, about any of the breakouts, about what we ought to be doing, anything. So Guru, go for it.
Thank you, Russ. And the last I checked, all the 36 people who are here are real people, none of them bots. So we're hoping we can have some good discussion here. As I mentioned yesterday during my opening comments, NAE was very pleased to work with Russ Taylor and colleagues in driving this conversation that we have had. But the question is, it was driven by the motivation on what could the National Academy of Engineering or the National Academies at large could be doing to help advance the nuances and the elements that cover the subject to the next level to drive policy action. That was a primary interest through which we started thinking about, and the community came together and we saw the results of this. Although much work needs to be done, this was a fantastic situational analysis. We saw good data. We saw where the deficiencies are. We also saw what the prospects are, opportunities are. So I think one of the contributions of this workshop, the report itself, which is not an official report of the National Academy of Engineering, but it could stimulate an official activity within the National Academy of Engineering. And that's a primary interest of ours. And so we have had a number of National Academy of Engineering members at this meeting, and also a number of National Academy of Medicine members here. And that is something within the academies, we are very interested in driving a joint NAE and NAM activity to think about this. We think about preparedness from a number of different angles, and the reports that the National Academies produce have a different role in society. And of course, the reports that CCC produces, community developed, also have a different role. So I think collaboratively, they could have greater effect than either or in this case. So I think we want to capitalize on that synergy here. And Anne and I are open minded here to hear any comments you might have on what could each or either institution do going forward to continue this dialogue or stimulate policy action here. And do you want to say anything before we jump into an open discussion here? Again, this is an open mic session. Any and all comments welcome.
No, I think you covered it all. I think, once again, just really appreciative for everyone, and know that we're going to continue, as this is a community effort, doing what we can for the community. I mentioned it in the breakout I was in about an hour ago that we are planning to submit a proposal to AAAS to share this with the broader science community. That's a science and press meeting, but as we look for avenues, having a community report is really important for us.
If this is too much of an ask, you are also welcome to reflect on the workshop at large in the 2 days. And even as you close your eyes and think about, it would have been nice if we had also talked about X. What would that X be? Because it's helpful, whether for this report or not, but maybe for the subsequent thinking. So please feel free to share your thoughts here.
There's one question I saw here privately that maybe we haven't actually thought about. The question was, how long are we going to keep that editing link open? We haven't really discussed that, but on the one hand, you say, gee, we'd like everyone's input soon, and giving a deadline helps that. On the other hand, you don't want to shut people off. So
here's my experience from past workshops and so forth. My strong recommendation is to write if you have thoughts this afternoon while everything's fresh in your mind, or if you're the type of person who likes to reflect by Monday. I think we're going to keep it open. A week is generally good. If we leave it much longer than that, then it just sits and sits. And I think we want to start trying to pull everything together in that time. But there will be more opportunities. Once we write the draft report, we will send it out to everyone here to say, what did we miss? Did we represent everything accordingly? But so let's say that end of the day next Friday is when we'll take the link down, but really try within the next 24 to 72 hours to get your thoughts while they're still fresh in your mind and the discussions are still there.
Yeah, I mean, almost all of us have been in lots of these, often in person. The one thing we're missing, Guru, is the cocktail party.
Yeah, and you don't have the plane ride home to do your thinking.
Well, there's that, but generally speaking, what they often do is lock you in a room until you've produced something, and we can't quite do that. But it seems like a week is. I'll try to do it by Monday. As long as things are fresh and everyone's excited, it's usually easier. But moving on, I mean, are there other sort of on the broader subjects? Are there other things that people have thoughts? Guru?
From Academy's perspective, we have the privilege within the organization to attack or even expand the subject from multiple angles. You know, this could be made solely an economic policy issue, and there goes a report on that theme. But the kind of comprehensiveness we want to bring to the subject, which is just basically necessary for this, you know, we can engage colleagues from Earth and Life Studies, disaster resilience programs. There are a number of illustrious colleagues within the Academy's mind, and the Health and Medicine Division really has thought quite a bit about medical interventions, technologies, and whatnot. So, and of course, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Division. All of this could be fruitfully brought together for a more comprehensive vision for the role and the functioning of robotics, not just for health, but also safety and well-being of society. So that's the kind of a higher level perspective I have been articulating within the academies. And I would welcome, again, this is an open question or opportunity to help refine my own thinking so that I could take the case to our leadership.
Okay. Well, we're not seeing a lot of stuff coming in on the chat. Are there people sort of from not the robotic side who might contribute a little bit of, well, first, what did we do wrong in this workshop? I don't believe it's nothing. What could have been better in this workshop other than a cocktail party? Chris?
My only suggestion was that by assigning people questions in small groups right away, it kind of prevented open discussion. So perhaps having a first open discussion section with small groups would have been helpful.
Okay, like before each, extend the thing after the little sub keynotes, or before any of the three breakout questions?
I think it would have been nice to have small breakout groups that are a little bit just more open-ended near the beginning, maybe after the first sub keynotes.
Or the first keynote,
sure.
after Zeke's talk. Just, oh, okay, well.
Out of curiosity, Chris, are there things you feel like we should have discussed that we didn't discuss? You know, like, is this motivated by the fact that you would kind of hope something would come up and it never did, or is this just a general comment?
No, I think it's just a general comment. It would have been, I kind of think, kind of nice to feel like you know, your intellectual juices are flowing a little bit before getting onto some specific questions, and also just getting used to the format.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, either that would have squozed something, or we would have needed more time in the total workshop. Do you feel like rather than a 2-day, a 3-day workshop would have been okay?
I think, well, you know, we're also, you know, organizing various conferences and so on, and it just seems like sitting for 5-6 hours on Zoom is a bit fatiguing. So perhaps having shorter workshop days over 3 days would be appreciated.
Okay. That's a useful comment. I think we did what we did partly because we were afraid that people's calendars would be harder to clear for 3 days, but it's certainly a good point.
We kind of call them the note takers, but they indeed are the future leaders. Any comments from the distinguished students, medical students, engineering students who are here? What are we not thinking correctly here? Where is our thinking clouded? What are we assuming here?
Well,
if I could answer the last two questions together, I felt that at least in the second breakout group today, we had a good discussion about the role of industry and the regulatory environment and partnerships there. I felt that maybe in future workshops, it would be better to represent people who have maybe a different mix of work with industry and maybe some more experience with the regulatory environment, because I felt that today we were sort of having a very nice discussion, but I don't think anyone was super directly experienced with that. At least that was the feeling that I got.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Others?
I think Alex brings up a good point. I also think we could have done a better job of involving industry, which we didn't.
Yeah, I agree with that. And
Yeah.
so that was.
So I was in the same group too that he alludes to. And one thing, I think there were a lot of techie people in that group. So there's a balance also. I mean, I know we talked about it before the meeting, but to have a balance between people who push technology and people who understand, appreciate the need for technology. I think that mix, it's always hard to hit that balance, but maybe there's a better way we could have done it.
Well, I just
And I just want to throw in that
we could still, in the writing phase, still be going out to industry. So I would say just to everybody who's here, if you think there's somebody who would have been great to have at the workshop but wasn't here, you could still reach out to them and ask for their input or comments on the report just to get that feedback.
Terrific idea.
That's a really good point.
Really good point. Thank you.
And without being an apologist, just as an explanation, I'd like to give a big shout out to Russ and Greg, who really pushed to get this done so quickly. And I think it's better to have something sooner than something perfect later on. And so let's get those industry people and let's fix all the things we can. But having something in place is more likely to, particularly when we're looking at, we could still make a difference between now and the end of COVID. So I think this is one of the exciting things, even though the time pressure has been a little tough.
Well, I would just like to add to that. I would like to underscore the importance of being timely, because I think that the next few months will be absolutely critical in our country. And I'm especially concerned about what happens at the end of the summer when all the students return to their respective schools. And that means that people from all across the country will aggregate at universities all across the country.
Yeah, it's something I honestly never thought I'd be faced. I mean, you read about 1918 and
any other comments from young professionals here?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, oh, sorry. This is Tamara Barboza.
Please.
So my background's in emergency preparedness, and I completed my master's degree in healthcare emergency management, so specifically looking at hospitals. And then I went on, I'm doing my doctorate now in occupational therapy, and I really enjoyed listening to Michelle Johnson talk about that rehab end user side of this technology. So in school, when we're thinking about disaster preparedness, and we're also thinking about technology, we're so focused on electronic healthcare records, but the technology that's available beyond that is not something we talk in detail about, because as a rehab kind of idea, we're looking at the different supports that can help our clients be independent and successful. But when thinking about this pandemic, a big thing that came up in our discussion, I was lucky to finish my hands-on clinical field work right the week that there was a shutdown in California, actually. And so what happens is that a lot of these students that are going to go out and do their clinicals have either been just short term, have been canceled or postponed, or they've been given the opportunity to do telehealth for their entire rotation, which I think, you know, a lot of us hands-on clinical practitioners really want that hands-on. It cannot be replaced by telehealth, but I think a new skill set is coming, right? And I think that this, like a lot of people have voiced, is that it needs to be embedded in the curriculum. So it needs to go beyond just the electronic healthcare record, really thinking about how this technology piece can be incorporated within our education. And from my personal opinion, I think that disaster management needs to be highly embedded into the curriculum as well, because we're going to see not only just climate change disasters related to climate, wherever people may live, which can impact their participation, but also with the pandemic. And I think it's something that's been on the side burner. It hasn't been prioritized. And now this raising awareness piece is going to incorporate technology into curriculum, but also as a way for learning, right? So a lot of the students now are learning through technology, and how we obviously can't replace that human to human interaction, but I do want to make people more educated and understand how to use it. And just one last thought, sorry, I'm kind of rambling, but I just really enjoyed the nice discussion of people that talked about, Professor Shaw talked about inclusivity and diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I think that's a huge piece that technology can also play to make sure that all of these different individuals are having access to that. And also just the fact that we can tailor it to the needs of our people, clients that we're working with. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for your comments. Excellent synthesis, really.
If you can get those written into that document,
yes.
Please
send us your bullet points. We will use them.
Well,
okay, I'll try my best. Thank you.
To whatever length you want. You can.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Sure.
Others,
thank you.
Okay. Who else? Andy, I see you there.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I think these past 2 days have been really great and productive conversations. I really enjoyed, as Tamara has mentioned, the conversations that Michelle has brought. I had the honor of being in her group yesterday, and I thought the discussion there was really great, talking about the adaptability of robotic systems and how there needs to be further improvement in that regard. Overall, just really great conversations all around, and thank you again for having me.
And again, we're sure if you got the time today, put some of your thoughts into the document. But let's see, other students, we could put a few more on the spot. I see Araman on my list here.
Yeah, again, as Tamara and Annie said, thank you for having us. I think one point that really struck me was the one we ended on today's breakout about how to excite the public and policymakers about this work, because that is going to be one of the biggest drivers for change. I look at it kind of similar to what Elon Musk has done with his work. And Elon is definitely arguably a controversial character, but the excitement he's generated for SpaceX, just the amount of public support that they have, is something that's incredible and something that could be very valuable for robotics to have, alongside the really increasing need for researchers to, I think, have a bigger hand in policy making, because the expertise that
researchers can provide is tremendous. And so I think it's valuable to look forward how we can be more effective as policymakers and spokespeople to drum up both governmental and public support for the work that we're trying to do.
Excellent point and a timely one. Others? We're technically supposed to adjourn 2:15. Who wants to have the last question or a comment?
I just wanted to piggyback on what Tamara and Ari was saying, that I like the touches of policy making, but also pushing it a little bit farther, not just for like social media and policy, but also outreach, right? We're trying to get to those younger people in education. I think we talked a little bit about that, and low income spaces, but it would be great to kind of push as well.
Very good. The last 2 points, the core really related to how do we get good at communicating the work that we do and the value of the work that comes with. And that's something, at least over a decade of I work here in Washington, it's often frustrating for an engineer brought up in the rational principles to really expect the world to think like you. And it often, it reminds me of what a mentor of mine used to say, that sometimes scientists and engineers are like American tourists abroad. If you speak louder, you think they would understand you, but that's not the case. And so I think we have an opportunity here to get better at the narrative flair that we are all consumers of, beneficiaries of, and bringing it to our work. So the last 2 points were particularly.
Could I maybe just share one thought? One of the things that we found really exciting when we had challenges at the medical center was being able to just partner engineers with expertise with people that have unmet needs. And maybe a really short-term thing that this group could do would just be a way to connect people with unmet needs in different spheres with experts in robotics. Mm-hmm. And I think there might be a way to package that maybe through a website or a central place that we could advertise, that people could triage and just make connections. And that might be, in the short term, a really beneficial, helpful thing to do.
Mm-hmm. The National Robots Jobs Jar, basically.
But Brian, it doesn't have to be through a website. I mean, we live in a Zoom world. I mean, to set up something more focused around a subset of problems where clinicians, practitioners, healthcare professionals bring problems, and we can, the analogous to the meetups you organize at Penn Health Tech. I mean, we could easily do that in specific problem areas.
Yeah, so the way those work is that somebody comes with an unmet need or a new technology, and then we have people very quickly explain to a small group of experts in that area who have interest, and then come away with action items after a very brief, nowadays Zoom meeting, we call them faculty salons. But I think this group could really do that.
Gee, any suggestions that you have for implementing that would be really, really, really appreciated. I do remember back when the shutdowns were all starting, we had, at Hopkins, some discussions with primarily ICU people, and that led to a few things, including what we're done. I'm sure Daniela had the same sort of experience, but your suggestion of systematizing that a bit more, so rather than it just be anecdotal, seems like a really good idea if it can be made to happen.
Sure, we'll send some things about how we do it. I think there's a way to do that.
Okay. Would it be like cross institutions or like within an institution? It's sometimes easier, but.
Well,
I was going to say, in this world, it doesn't matter where you are. So
it doesn't for understanding the problem. Sometimes it still does matter in terms of the people worrying about IP and so forth. I mean, one of the nice things about what we've been doing with our ICU robot is we haven't worried too much about that. And so we.
Well, I think that's a matter of establishing some ground rules, right? Like,
yeah.
you want to have an open discussion. The discussion is open, so there's no NDA you need to sign or anything like that. And that's what we do in academia, right? We try to exchange ideas. We don't try to get hung up on.
Yeah.
I think the problems are too acute for letting those things be barriers. The other thing that we found is that we actually just started corresponding with a similar group at Mass General and at WashU in St. Louis, and found that we were all doing redundant things. So by sharing what we did with ventilators or what materials we sourced for making face masks and things like that, we saved a lot of redundant work. And I think that doing it cross-institutionally, we could learn a lot from each other.
I agree.
No, I agree. We did the same thing at Hopkins. I'm sure, I think I said this earlier, you can go to any university and I bet you find history repeating itself over and over again. One way to think about moving ahead with this is, we've got several universities already represented. Essentially, we could all agree we're going to set up a discussion forum, and then, once it's established, we can make it open for others to join. It really just takes somebody to kind of lead and do a little bit of management of it to make sure it doesn't fall by the wayside or get out of control.
I mean, we could see if Brian wants to volunteer.
I'd be happy to help with that.
Go ahead.
Might need some other people to chip in, but of course.
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to help chip in.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think it's a great idea. And it in a way, it's an immediate dividend from the time that people have spent here in the last couple of days.
Yeah, I think a couple of workarounds to help us support it, it wouldn't be that hard to put on.
Absolutely.
I know a group of us are going to hang on and get together for some writing work, but it seems prudent to adjourn this meeting at this high point before it dwindles further. And on behalf of NAE, on behalf of CCC, and of course our illustrious organizers, thank you all so much for joining. We know how busy each of you are. You even entertained our invitation here, so that's that even consumes time. So thank you again for joining, and we'll be in touch. Again, this is we've all thought of building a network here, so this is just a starting point in that, and look forward to our journey together. Thank you so much.
Okay. I think our plan is to keep are we going to keep this link open for doing
the main link remains active for a few of us here.
Okay, and if people want to start contributing, yeah, there is the link again for the